The more stories I collect, the more I start to question what our reality actually is. Like Plato's allegory of the cave, perhaps what we think of as real is nothing more than flickering shadows across a dim wall. Our minds try their best to piece together these echoes of reality with our limited senses. But the great world of truth lies beyond our reach and comprehension. But there are some of us who can, and do, perceive reality very differently. After reading my last two stories, my friend Steve spoke of one of these people. His ex-girlfriend, Christine. They had met at university, where they attended the same psychology course. From the first time he saw her, he knew that she was special. She had an otherworldly quality to her, mixed with a strange intensity that he saw in few others. She was exceptionally bright, almost inhumanly so, and it took several weeks of relentless courtship before she relented to finally start dating him. It was months into their relationship that Steve was able to piece together why Christine was like no other person he had known. She was an individual with a rare form of synesthesia, which gave her a very unique perspective on the world. She processed stimuli in a very different way. Her brain mixed up her senses so that she could hear colors, smell sounds, or even taste numbers. She was a genius at mathematics because she could intuitively feel the right answers. They would taste right to her. She had this ability for as long as she could remember. Growing up, she had assumed everybody could do it too. It was not until third grade when she asked her teacher why the school bell always smelled like oranges did she discover she was different. Her classmates would laugh at her, call her a freak. So, she would avoid talking about her abilities and kept it secret throughout high school. Her synesthesia only got stronger as she got older. By the time school ended, she had already decided to devote herself to the study of the human mind so she could learn more about herself. Steve was the first person since primary school that she had trusted enough to tell. She had loved the fact Steve was also a psychology major and was just as intrigued as she was about her ability. They spent countless hours discussing how she experienced the world, which was so much richer and varied than he could imagine. She told him that the number 1 tasted like chocolate, 3 was cinnamon, 6 was garlic, and 8 was cut grass. For her, doing multiplications, for example, was like cooking. She could taste the result and know if the answer was right. It seemed as if she experienced a whole new other world that no one else could sense. The most intense of her sensations were for colors. Each color had a unique voice and personality. It spoke to her, especially when she touched it. Red was an old woman, kind and gentle, like a grandmother. Blue was angry, impatient, always rushing her. Green was stern and strict, while yellow was proud and arrogant. Black was pure silence, the absence of all sound. Her favorite was white, seductive, passionate. She loved wearing white. There was one colour that she truly feared though, and that was dark grey. Even just a shade above black, and she would start to hear whispers rising from the silence. A few shades lighter, and the voices would get louder. Evil voices whispering in her ear, delighting in telling her how her skin would be flayed strip by strip from her conscious body, how her flesh would be devoured and torn from her bones while she was still awake, how her eyeballs would be scooped from her skull so she could see 1,000 pointed teeth tearing at her face. Needless to say, she hated nighttime and the darkness. She had to always sleep with the lights on and with sleeping tablets so she wouldn't dream when her eyes were closed. When Steve and Christine eventually moved in together, they found an old apartment in a nice neighborhood with white plaster walls all around. It was perfect for them, close to the university and to their work. Very spacious and surprisingly affordable. Christine had loved the feel of it the moment she saw it, and Steve would have no complaints about how much friskier she was in that white apartment. Steve was careful to avoid any grey in the house. Each room was a different colour to match its purpose. Their study was green and their kitchen was red. Their bedroom in particular was furnished all in white, from the painted wardrobe to the white bed linen and the white carpet. Steve even took care with the lighting to avoid any shadows casting grey spots in the room. In their first week there, both had failed to attend any classes due to their extensive love-making sessions. It was after one of these particularly passionate sessions, while Steve lay asleep on the bed, that Christine noticed a faint crack in the opposite wall. Against the stark white plaster, the thin, grey line seemed to whisper imperceptibly to her from across the room. While it did annoy her, she decided to deal with it tomorrow, as they had a lot of catching up with classes to do. She took her sleeping pills and drifted off to a dreamless slumber. For the next day, she had completely forgotten about the crack until she was in bed again, staring at it. It became like an itch, one she could not scratch. It became more noticeable because she knew it was there. It called and beckoned to her, whispering to her to get closer. The more she gazed at it, the wider and thicker that grey crack seemed to get. She nudged at Steve, who reassured her that it was just her imagination. He assured her he would paint over the wall on the weekend if it bothered her too much. True to his word, Steve filled the hairline crack with plaster and painted over the wall twice. It did not help. She could still hear the voice calling to her. Her strategy now was to avoid looking at the wall, to banish it by completely ignoring it. But in her mind, she could still see that crack. Now, the width of a thick pencil. She was sure that the last words she would hear repeatedly as she drifted off to her medicated sleep was a ghostly, "I'm here," and "No more hiding." One night, she decided she could ignore it no longer and had to face it. As she stared at that crack, which crept across the entire wall, she gasped as a bony finger began to poke out from its center and started to explore. She watched in mute horror as a second skeletal finger reached out from the gap and began feeling around the edges. She screamed so loud that Steve fell off the bed as he woke and pulled off his sleeping mask. Christine pointed at the empty wall, crying with teary eyes about a skeleton crawling out from behind there. Steve could see nothing, but no amount of consoling would convince her to spend another night in that room. She ended up staying over at a friend's place overnight, and she refused to go back to that apartment until that wall was knocked down to prove she wasn't crazy. While Steve was hesitant to lose their bond by destroying a perfectly good wall to chase some ghost, he weighed that up against losing a great apartment and his girlfriend. With great reluctance, he laid down some plastic on the floor and smashed a crowbar against the wall as Christine watched on. Where there used to be a covered-up hairline crack, there was now a gaping hole that Steve started tearing at with his hands. With a quarter of the wall ripped, both Steve and Christine were stunned to find a crouching human skeleton stuffed against the cavities and covered in cobwebs. They called the police to report their gruesome discovery. After extensive questioning, they were cleared of being suspects, as the body had clearly been there long before Steve and Christine were even born. In the decades past, the building had shady tenants and a very different neighborhood, a known crime hotspot. It was a slum area that had been slowly fixed up over the past few years, its history plastered and painted over until it was respectable. The skeleton was traced back to a missing persons case from 1973. Reported as missing by her mother, the victim was a young prostitute with a petty criminal record, a profile the police back then devoted precious few resources or sympathy to follow up. The police thought it was likely she was murdered and walled up by one of the previous occupants, a notorious gang member who himself was killed in 1982 in a fight over money. The skeletal remains were eventually given a proper burial next to her long-deceased mother, a long overdue reunion. Luckily for Steve, the apartment owner was also understanding enough to pay for the repairs to the wall, given the circumstances. However, try as they might, the rest of their life couldn't return to normal for the couple. The ordeal gave Christine constant nightmares about skeletons breaking through the wall, despite the sleeping pills, nor would the voices stop tormenting her. Eventually, she turned to harder narcotics to find any release to escape from her reality. The pressures of completing a degree and caring for Christine's drug abuse put an unbearable strain on their relationship, and they broke off soon after. It was just mentally too difficult for either of them to cope. Since then, Steve has been in and out of several relationships over the years. A few days ago, he decided to track down Christine again to get more details for this story. He ended up speaking with her parents. Christine had continued to struggle with drug addiction for several years after their breakup. Chronically short of money, she was constantly on the move from place to place. Her last known location was a rundown motel where she had skipped rent and left all her meager belongings behind. Her parents had tried to track her down and even enlisted the help of a private investigator. Christine was eventually found a few months ago. The motel she had stayed at was being demolished to make way for new apartments. In her former room, behind a wall with a crack running across it, her skeletal remains were found, trapped between the dark, grey concrete